Throughout history, there have been many horrific execution methods devised and invented to bring the life of someone to a rough and painful end. Crowds who flocked to witness executions loved to see the brutal methods, and they wanted to see maximum punishment and suffering for those who had been convicted of terrible crimes. For example, in France, the people hated witnessing guillotine executions as they thought it was too clinical and quick, and they preferred seeing the breaking wheel. With this, a condemned person was strapped to a cartwheel on a platform, and an executioner then shattered and broke their bones using clubs and other weapons, and the witnesses loved to hear the screaming and shouting of the victim. In England, there was a horrific method used to execute people over the centuries, and this was known as hanging, drawing and quartering, and one part of this was immensely barbaric, and it involved someone's remains being cut into different pieces to be then publicly displayed. But what is the history behind quartering? To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe. Quartering in its most simple form is the remains of someone being cut into 4 pieces, or 4 pieces being taken from their body following their execution ordeal. It is dismemberment, the removal of the limbs and body parts as a method of capital punishment. Throughout history, this has been associated with regicide, the assassination or attempted assassination of a monarch, and some victims even had their limbs ripped from their body by horses who would be driven off in different directions, leaving just the torso of the condemned. One man who suffered this was the attempted assassin Francois Ravaillac, and it was said of his ordeal that he was condemned to be tortured with red-hot pincers on 4 limbs and on each breast. His wounds were to be sprinkled with molten lead and boiling oil, and his body was then to be torn in pieces by 4 horses, the remains being subsequently burned. Quartering was deployed for many centuries inside of different lands, and in the Holy Roman Empire, Charles V's definition claimed, concerning quartering, to cut and hack apart his entire body into 4 pieces, and thus be punished unto death, and such 4 parts are to be hanged on stakes publicly on 4 common thoroughfares. Specifically, the word quartering indicates that a prisoner or victim would be cut into 4 pieces, or have 4 pieces or their 4 limbs cut from their torso. In England and Britain, it was part of the infamous execution method, hanged, drawn and quartered. This execution ordeal was said to have been the worst used inside of the nation against those who were convicted of the incredibly serious crime of high treason. This method had many different stages, and quartering was the final step of the harrowing ordeal for the condemned. It was first written into law for high treason under the laws of King Edward III, but was used for centuries before. With hanging, drawing and quartering, the condemned was brought to their place of execution on a hurdle, being tied to this behind the back of a horse. They were dragged sometimes for miles throughout towns and cities, and thousands of people saw the criminals being taken to their deaths in this manner. When they arrived at the scaffold at places such as Tyburn in London, they would be taken by an executioner, who secured them via a noose around the neck to the gallows, and then removed the stool they were standing on, hanging them until they were almost dead. When the executioner noticed that they were nearly at the end of their life, they cut them down and revived them for the execution ordeal to continue. The victim was then eviscerated, and their private parts were cut off and burned in front of them in a fire, and a large cut was made to the condemned, and they had their internal organs removed and then thrown onto a fire. Somehow it was possible for the condemned to be alive at this point. Following this, they would then be taken over to an executioner's table, and he then, using his axe, cut the head off the victim before quartering their remains, cutting their limbs off, and then leaving the torso. These 4 pieces would then be sent off to different towns and cities to be displayed in front of thousands of people. It was common for merchants and townsfolk to see the remains of executed people placed above gatehouses or on town walls to instigate fear into people not to commit crimes. The quartering part of the execution ordeal was probably the most significant and effective, as the point of it was to put people off committing crimes and to deter them from getting involved in serious actions, such as treason against the king. It had a very powerful effect, as well as being completely harrowing. For example, during the reign of King Edward I, the Welsh prince Dafydd ap Gruffudd was arrested in 1283 for treason after he declared himself the Prince of Wales. Edward ordered his execution, and he was pulled throughout the streets of Shrewsbury to his place of execution. He was hanged, drawn, disemboweled, and then quartered for plotting the king's death, and his right arm was sent to the city of York, his left arm to Bristol, right leg to Northampton, and left leg to Hereford, to tell people in these cities what would happen to traitors. His head was then set on a spear at the Tower of London. Another infamous rebel who incurred this during Edward I's reign was Braveheart William Wallace, a leader of the First War of Scottish Independence and a rebel warrior. Wallace was betrayed and handed over to the English, and he was forced to wear a crown of laurel leaves before being drawn to Smithfield, where he was hanged, drawn and quartered. His head was placed high above London Bridge, and his quarters were then sent to Newcastle, Berwick, Stirling and Perth, all towns and settlements in the north or across the border, to show the power of the English king in this region. There are no records that exist in Britain to show exactly how the corpse of someone was quartered, but there is an image showing the quartering of Sir Thomas Armstrong in 1684, and the executioner in this is making vertical cuts through the spine and removing the legs at the hip. It's believed that quartering does allude specifically to the removal of the limbs, and this was described during Dafydd ap Gruffydd's quartering as the right arm with a ring on the finger in York, the left arm in Bristol, the right leg and hip at Northampton, the left leg at Hereford, but the villain's head was bound with iron, lest it should fall into pieces from putrefaction, and set conspicuously upon a long spear shaft for the mockery of London. Many men who had signed the death warrant of King Charles I were hunted, being known as the regicides, and some who were captured were hanged, drawn and quartered. The executed king's son, Charles II, even had bodies dug up and posthumously executed. But one man who noticed the quarters and limbs of these regicides being displayed claimed, "I saw not their execution, but met their quarters, mangled and cut, and reeking, as they were brought from the gallows in baskets on the hurdle." When it came to displaying the remains of the condemned and executed, many of the limbs were usually parboiled or were covered in tar to preserve them. This was done for heads upon London Bridge, and the aim of this was to keep the limbs looking fresh, so they would be able to be shown for longer periods of time. Even salt and cumin would be added during the boiling process, salt helping the remains to not putrefy, and the cumin seeds would help keep birds away from pecking at them and eating the remains and flesh of the arms, legs, and other parts. As mentioned, quartering was probably the most important part of the execution process in England, as it led to the public display of the remains, with the intention of this being to deter people from committing the most serious offences and crimes across the realm, including high treason. People were not hanged, drawn and quartered for minor offences. It was the most serious of crimes that carried the penalty, but quartering was harrowing, seeing an executioner take an axe to the headless corpse of someone, chopping them to pieces. Sometimes the executioners who were not so skilled also took a long time to do this, as the thousands in attendance looked on at the awful spectacle. Thanks for watching. To support our channel, please make sure to subscribe, and once again, thank you so much for watching.